Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for letting me speak to you online today. My name is Dennis Fancett, and I'm part of the generous giving team at the Diocese of Newcastle, and I've been invited to share some thoughts with you on the subject of generosity. However, for some of us, if we're told that the speaker is going to talk about generosity, it can be a temptation to switch off. We might think, oh no, he's going to talk about money and that's not really something I want to listen to. The last thing we want is someone else telling us what we should be doing with our money. So you'll be pleased to know that actually whilst money comes into all areas of life, that's not really my subject for today. But I do want to raise some issues which I hope will help deepen our understanding of God and how we develop as his disciples. And to illustrate that point, I'm going to start off by telling you a little story. Now, this is a true story. I knew the people involved. One of them I knew particularly well. So it's about two fine Christian people. One is an Anglican, the other is a Baptist. And so the story starts with the Baptist guy. He was a missionary working abroad for the Baptist Missionary Society. But very sadly, he had a breakdown. It was quite serious, in fact, and he and his family needed to be returned to this country with some urgency. And it so happened that the Missionary Society had a network of safe houses around the country for such eventualities. And unbeknown to me, one of them was in the town where I used to live. And that's the house that this man and his family came to. But the local Baptist church, which you might have expected him to attend every Sunday, they didn't have a pastor at that particular time. We might call it an interregnum or a vacancy. And so our Baptist friend and his supervisors in the Missionary Society recommended he should just go to another church where he wouldn't be known and he wouldn't be lent upon to do all kinds of stuff that people might want or expect clergy to do, particularly during a vacancy. And so that's how this man and his family started coming to the church I was part of at the time. And that's how I got to know him. So a year or so passed, and our Baptist friend made good progress and he slowly recovered. But with his recovery came the realization that really he wasn't cut out to be a missionary. He'd need to resign from the Missionary Society, and that meant giving up his house and finding a new job. And that's not as easy as it sounds, especially when all you've ever done is to have been an ordained pastor and you've just had a breakdown. There were some part-time and zero-hour contract jobs that he could apply for, but they weren't going to pay anything like enough for him to find somewhere else for his family with two children to live. And so we were praying. And meanwhile, the deadline for giving up his house, which I have to say, the Missionary Society had graciously extended several times, but the final deadline drew closer and closer. And eventually it was just a couple of weeks away. And he had nowhere to go. And that's when he got a phone call. It was from a man he didn't know, someone he'd never spoken to before, someone he'd never met before. It was from the Anglican. And the Anglican said, look, I've heard that you're looking for somewhere to live. Well, I've just got a new job and I'm moving away, I'm moving out of the area, but for various reasons, I don't want to sell my house. Would you like to come and live in our house rent-free? Well, our Baptist friend was overwhelmed. He was quite tearful, in fact. It was such an amazing answer to prayer. And within a few days, he was going round to pick up the keys, and then after he'd been shown how everything works, where the boiler is and where the dustbins go and everything, he turned to the Anglican and he said, "Why are you doing this? I mean, you don't know me. I'm not part of your church. I'm not even part of your denomination. And yet you're letting me come and live in your house with my family rent-free. Why are you being so generous to me, someone you've never even met before?" And the Anglican replied and he said, "I'm being generous to you as an expression of the fact that God has been generous to me." And you see, there we have it. When we understand that God has been generous to us, it is surely our natural reaction that we too, in turn, will wish to be generous. And we see the same thing in the story of Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19 that we heard earlier. He meets Jesus. He realizes that Jesus accepts him. Jesus has even invited himself round for a meal. It doesn't matter who Zacchaeus is or what he's done before, Jesus accepts him. He realizes that he is a recipient of the grace of God. And Zacchaeus is so overwhelmingly grateful. In fact, it's a life-changing experience for him, and his natural response is to give. Not because he was asked to, not because he was prompted, not out of a sense of duty, but knowing that Jesus had accepted him and had received him, changed his perspective on life. He stands up and he makes his statement. He wants to give back. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's all very well, but Zacchaeus had a lot of money to start off with, and he and others who've got lots of money, they can afford to give. But what about ordinary people like us? What about people for whom money is tight and getting tighter? Well, let me just share with you that several years ago, I was privileged to spend a few months in Hong Kong, and whilst there, I attended the church that had been started by British missionary Jackie Pullinger and her amazing work amongst heroin addicts. And many of those people had found faith through her work and had started coming to church. But in Hong Kong, there's no welfare state. If you had no job, and these people didn't, then you had absolutely nothing. And yet, there was a song they used to sing in that church. It's a modern one, you may or may not know it. It has in it the line, "And now let the poor say, I am rich." And those former drug addicts with absolutely nothing, they used to sing that song with gusto. I mean, they'd got it. They had found God. And they knew that God had been generous to them. They considered themselves to be rich. And wherever and however they could, they gave back. So for us today, let's ask ourselves a question. Has God been generous? Has he been generous to me? Have I found him? Have I discovered him? Have I had an encounter with him? Now, whether that came initially from a single moment of revelation or explanation, as perhaps it did with Zacchaeus or St. Paul, but maybe it came over a period of years, as perhaps it did with the first disciples, and for many of us who have grown up in the church. Either way, once we know that God, through his gift of salvation, has been overwhelmingly gracious and generous to us, our only response is to want to be generous back to him. And that's surely why we give. It's surely why we give generously to our local parish church. That's why from time to time we review our giving to ensure it's keeping up with any salary or other increases that we might have had. Yet it's because we want to support the work of our parish or benefice. It's because whatever our parish is doing or wants to do to reach the community around us, we want to support that and be part of that. But it's also because we understand that God has been so amazingly generous to us. But it's not because, and I stress this, it's not because we've got to, because we haven't. It's not because someone's told us to. Hopefully, no one has. It's not because we feel pressurized or got at. No one should ever make us feel like that, certainly not anyone from the church. But it's because deep in our hearts, we want to say, yeah, I'm a person of faith. I've reached that point in my life where I say, I believe in God. And in some small way, God has made himself known to me, and I am a beneficiary of his outstanding generosity. And for that reason, like Zacchaeus, like thousands of others, both in previous generations and in our own generation, I too wish to give back to the God who has been so amazingly generous to me. Well, I hope that's been helpful. I hope it all thinks again about God's generosity to each of us and how we're responding to it as people of faith. And I hope it's prompting us to realise that our giving is without obligation, but it's a free will, natural response to our God and what he's done for us. So it's been a privilege to share my thoughts with you online. Thank you for listening. God bless you all. Amen.